lot of information out there on COVID-19 and how to manage it in the workplace. Very good information. What we're seeking to do in this webinar, which is perhaps a little bit different, is to draw it together from different areas. So instead of just focusing on privacy or on workplace, we're going to have a look at a whole range. We'll be picking up on a bit of discrimination and privacy and health and safety and employment management as well. Now, some of your questions are quite specific and some are more general. So we're going to go through each of those questions and hopefully answer most of them, although I doubt we'll be able to address all of your questions, but there will be plenty of opportunity perhaps next time to go through more. Overarchingly, a couple of messages that I do just want to give out is, firstly, be kind to everybody. This is a challenging time. It has been and it continues to be. People are fearful. They're still uncertain as to what it means for their workplace and their lives and what's coming next with Omicron. And don't judge people. There have been different decisions made about whether people will be vaccinated or not, although I think now we're well over 90% for at least the states down the eastern seaboard. So that response has been fantastic. But don't judge people for their decisions. We're going to have a look now at some of the questions and work through those. Alicia.
Yes, before we dive into some of the questions, just a few little points to make. Let me just share my screen again with everyone. So to introduce ourselves, my name is Alicia Gardini. I'm the General Manager of Certex International, and I'm joined by...
my name is Dianne Gibert. I'm the Managing Director and the founder of Certex.
So we'll be your presenters for today. Let me just move across to the next slide. So a couple of disclaimers that we just wanted to make clear, which also was in the registration form, that this webinar offers you an approach and a way of thinking about some of the pandemic issues and its effect on your workplace. This is not to be seen as legal advice or specific advice for you and your circumstances. There may be some additional information that we have not obtained or considered in this presentation. We have done our best to do really comprehensive research, but there is a lot out there and things are constantly changing. So if you do have specific questions about your particular set of circumstances, you may need to seek legal advice. And this is just us providing you the information as we see it at this point in time. We do have a few helpful resources for you. So these will come out in the slides and we won't spend time on them, but this is the various websites and links where you can get some information based on your state or territory. And there are also some workplace reference sites here, which relate to the government bodies or information bodies that can give you some support in some of the compliance issues that we're touching on today. Fantastic. So we will jump into the first poll. If I just take one moment to put the poll up.
We just realised we weren't sharing the screen with you.
Was I not sharing the screen?
No, but that's okay because you'll get to see those slides when they come out.
You'll see those in the slides, yeah. So let's just take one moment and I will put up the very first poll. We just wanted to ask you a little bit about which jurisdictions you have workers based in and which regulations are most important to you. So if you'd like to answer the poll, we'll just take a couple of seconds to do that now. Beautiful, we might end the poll now.
Actually, it's really interesting, these results, though, because I had anticipated a lot of interest from Victoria, New South, Queensland and ACT. But we have good representation from the other areas as well, Northern Territory, WA and Tasmania. So even if you're not located in those areas, you've got people who are working in those areas. So that's really useful to know. Now, because of the breadth of this as an issue and the different requirements in each of the jurisdictions, we may not be touching on all of those areas, but we're definitely doing the eastern coast. And if there are outstanding questions across some of the other areas, then we'll either respond to you directly on those or pick them up later.
Wonderful. So jumping into the very first question that we got, Dianne, will I breach privacy law by asking employees or customers for their vaccination status? Where do I store, manage and/or destroy this information?
Yeah, very good question. And the short answer is no, but it depends. And that is, it depends on how you collect the information. guess it could be a standard answer for many things. Employee vaccination status is considered sensitive. That's their sensitive health, sensitive personal information. So it falls into a different category from your normal personal information. And for this, you need basically two things. You need to have express consent to collect the information, and you need to ensure the information is held securely. Now, we're in a bit of an odd situation here with this information because we seem to be going across two types of legislative requirements with this question about asking employees for their vaccination status. Because interestingly, before you ask before you obtain their employee vaccination status, it will come under the Privacy Act. Once you've collected it and they're your employee, then as we know, there is an exemption in the Privacy Act for employee records. So then it falls under another category, which comes under Fair Work. So that's a little bit of an odd thing. But so to collect the information in the first place, yes, the Privacy Act does apply. And a few things that are needed for that. First, as a reminder, you may not be a privacy entity. That is, your income may not exceed the $3 million threshold, or you may not be dealing in personal information. But even if that's the case, you may choose, regardless, to participate in privacy and comply with the privacy regulations. And that would probably be a wise thing. If you do decide or need to comply, then there are a few things that you'll need to have in place to collect the vaccination information for your employees. One is a privacy policy, and it would be wise to update that so that it properly reflects this type of information, just very generally, because it's only a policy. But the second thing is, and this is where you'll go into a lot more detail, it's your collection notice. And this is the notice that you'll give as you're collecting this vaccination status information from your employees. Now, how you write it up is up to you. There are some minimum requirements set out in the Australian Privacy Principle number 5. And I thought the easiest way to demonstrate this for you is to show you what our own is. So we have our own particular circumstances in terms of our structure. We're in Victoria, so our jurisdiction is possibly different from where you're coming from. But here's something that you can think about. And again, you'll get this in the slides, but we have Fathom. It's the corporate services entity for the group that does include Certex. It also includes our consulting business. Fathom is not bound by the Privacy Act, but we've elected to comply with the principles, and our privacy policy is available. Here would be a link. As an employer, we are required to collect and retain information about our employees. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become a legal requirement for Victorian employers to collect information on the vaccination status of employees. If you choose not to provide us with this information, then our work options for you may be limited and possibly may no longer exist. The information we will collect from you will be contained in your COVID-19 digital certificate, which includes your name, date of birth, a unique document number, and validity date. It's likely we'll also need to collect information on booster vaccination, but this will be explained at the time of collecting that information. So this notice won't be good for the future. We'll do another one in the future. We may disclose your vaccination status to other businesses where you're asked to attend their work sites and as required by the government, such as to Fair Work inspectors and Services Victoria, probably others. Information about your vaccination status will be held electronically in your personal folder here, which has restricted access, and it will be de-identified or destroyed within 7 years. Now, yours is going to be a little different. You could make it briefer or longer, but basically they're the key points that you'd like to share with people as you're collecting the information. Now, we did have a question from one of you, and thank you for it, asking, is it necessary to have the collection notice signed and returned to the business? Because it's a lot of work doing that. There are differences in opinions. As I mentioned, you need to have express permission. So that's not implied. Simply by giving you the information in response to the collection notice, that would be implied. Express means verbal or written confirmation that they've understood the collection notice. So I guess the technical answer is yes. The answer that I would give you, though, as an auditor, is we're all about risk management here. And providing you share enough information so people know what's going on. What's the risk that somebody might then complain that they didn't receive the collection notice? Well, if you've got it and it's in your procedures and you can demonstrate that you have shared it with everybody, then possibly the risk is quite low. The penalty, if there is a problem, is a difficult one. There are penalties in the Privacy Act, but in my experience, they've only been very rarely imposed. I would think the main thing here is this is an opportunity to engage with your workers and your customers and build trust. This is less perhaps a legislative-driven requirement, although that definitely is there. It's more about ensuring people understand what you're doing and why. There's hardly likely to be a major misunderstanding because everyone knows what's going on and it's well understood why the information is being collected. So I hope that answers that question.
It's a very fascinating answer, actually, Dianne, because privacy is one of the points of COVID vaccination and the related compliance issues that I feel I know the least about, and it's one of the more complex unknown areas. So that was very helpful. Thank you. Another question that we got is, how should I respond if an employee refuses to be vaccinated?
I'll start by saying there is no compulsion for workers to become vaccinated unless they are in those top tier high risk industries. So if they're working in aged care or health or education, and a handful of others, then yes, they possibly must be vaccinated. But even then, nobody is insisting that they will be vaccinated. That is entirely their choice. And this is why I say there is no judgment. People can make their own call. The problem, though, is that if they are not vaccinated and their workplace requires it, then what are they going to do? They can't work in their normal field, quite possibly. Maybe they can find another role. Maybe they can find another work arrangement, such as working from home, or there are a couple of things that you might like to consider. So outside of the top tier areas, if somebody decides that they won't be vaccinated, you could consider them working from home where they're not engaging with other people, or working odd shifts, maybe where they're coming into the office where there's nobody else. But there's other measures as well to consider. How risky really is the situation? What's the level of infection locally? Unfortunately, here in Victoria, it's still really high. I looked at the numbers again this morning. They're over 12,000. 1,200.
12,000 would be concerning.
Dreadful. Well, we're nearly 12,000 active cases. It's 11,500. So look, it's clearly still a thing. But Queensland, on the other hand, I don't know the numbers, but they're an awful lot less than that. So you could say the risk of local transmission is much lower. So outside of those areas that are required by legislation to be vaccinated to work, these are some of the considerations that you'd need to think about. There's been a couple of court cases that have come up on this very matter. The last one has come out with a different result, but the principles remain the same, which has been interesting. So for the first two, the first one to start with, the situation was that there are 10 plaintiffs within the health, aged care, construction and education industries who'd all made informed decisions to not be vaccinated. And they argued the requirement for mandatory vaccination was unlawful. But the court held that the health orders, which of course were to be vaccinated, were not, if you're in the workplace, were not contrary to the consent of those individuals, and nor were they impeding anyone's rights and freedoms. Similar for the next one, where the court held that the employers were complying with the Chief Health Officer orders, and that distinguished it from the OH&S consultation. And there's been another case here in Victoria as well, not listed on that page. One of most interest that you would probably have heard about is the CFMEU and Mount Arthur Coal, or the BHP case, where BHP had issued a site access restriction survey to all of their workers, asking their comment on whether they should be vaccinated to enter the workplace. And based on that, they made a decision that anyone entering their work sites will need to be vaccinated. The union took them to court to say there had been a lack of consultation, and the full court of the Fair Work Commission upheld that. Their comment was that workers were not provided with information relating to the reasons, the rationale, and the data supporting the proposal, nor were they given a copy of the risk assessment or a informed analysis that underpinned the assessment and the decision. They also said that this turned on the facts of this particular situation. So I think we can take from that, on the one hand, absolutely engage with your workers, understand their situation. And we've got a suggestion right at the end here of the steps you can work through. And that's a really important part of managing the pandemic in your workplace. Speak to your workers. But on the other hand, the court did say that this was an unusual decision. And if the facts were different, then quite possibly the result would have been the same as the first two. Now, there are different sets of requirements for vaccination across the different jurisdictions, but they differ really in the way they've been structured, not in the final result. And from both Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, pretty much workplaces, you need vaccination. Pretty much most of the essential places where services are received, you need to be vaccinated to attend. But we're seeing changes all the time. In Queensland, from the 17th of December, which is in just over a week's time, restrictions will only apply to unvaccinated people. So that's the way they've presented their information. Here in Victoria, the mandate for vaccination in workplaces actually expires next week. New South Wales, it's they're in a different situation. Again, it's their recommendations began back in October. So we're seeing shifts and movements, but the overall requirement is basically the same. Yes, you should be vaccinated. Now, a few things to consider. It comes back to risk. And what is your jurisdiction? So what does your state or territory require? Which industry are you in? If it's the tier 1 as identified by Fair Work, high risk, then yeah, you need vaccination. But also think about the work activities, because even individuals in tier 1, if they're working in a low contact situation, perhaps they don't need to be vaccinated. And consider options where they're not engaging with others, working from home, different shifts, that sort of thing. If you are still finding that there are individuals who are either refusing to be vaccinated or refusing to advise you, then, and you can't get around it, then there's possibly no work for them. I'd suggest you get legal advice in that situation.
Fantastic. Our next question is about an employee who does not want to return to the office. What can you do in that situation? Now, before we dive into the answer, and we also have some statistics to share with you, we wanted to do our own poll and see what you think about returning to the office and working arrangements. So you should have a few options up there on the screen. If you'd like to provide your answers, we'll just pause for a couple of seconds to allow you some time to answer the question, and we'll compare it with the data that we have. Just a few more. Beautiful. I will end the poll now. We've got most people who have answered, and I'll share the results. So very interesting here that most people have said returning to either pre-COVID arrangements or a mix of both, which is very interesting.
It is actually. I think everyone here on this webinar that's responded is a bit more out there, perhaps. I don't know what the word is. So you do differ slightly from the general population, but it's really interesting. So whereas we're seeing here, I think we've got 70% say a mix of both, and the balance is with return to the previous working arrangements. The results of the survey that's being done, it was done by Telstra actually, but I picked up the information from Esquire's Patton Boggs blog. And they said that where you were saying 70% of you wanted to have a mix of both, their results show only 22%. The majority in their survey was that employees wanted to return to their previous working arrangements. So that's a really interesting thing. I think probably what we can draw from that is that there are variations. For some people, it's been working really well, and for others, not. So, as I've said before, and one of my key messages is talk to your staff, talk to your people, find out what they have going on in their own lives, which will be driving their decision on this. And oftentimes, too, it's not just their own work preference. There can be other things that might be driving this. Are they particularly vulnerable? Do they have health issues themselves? Even if you're vaccinated, we know that you can still become ill. So that's a factor. Maybe they're looking after people at home who are vulnerable. Maybe traveling into the office can be problematic. So I think there's a strong reason to speak with everybody about what their own expectations or preferences are, and then explore the extent to which you can accommodate. From a legal perspective, there is no real requirement to provide flexible working relationships unless you've engaged a worker under an award, in which case there certainly are obligations on you to consider flexible working arrangements. But I think even putting that aside, it makes sense to do so to build the trust. And the other reason, of course, is there's talk about this great resignation coming to the Australian shores. They're predicting March. No idea how they predict that, but that's when it's going to hit, apparently. And providing flexibility like this will make a big difference to whether you can retain staff or not. So, yeah, be creative. Ask and be creative.
So the next question that we have is about travelling Australia. So our employees used to travel around Australia. How should we manage this now?
Well, this one's not easy. Travel is opening up and it is becoming easier. In fact, I came back from a trip to Sydney earlier this week, but do treat it with caution because we've still got border restrictions. Quarantines are a problem. Barnaby Joyce, our own Deputy Prime Minister, has now contracted the illness. He's in Washington, and that's going to play havoc with his program and his quarantine and his return to Australia. And that's a commitment and a responsibility that certainly doesn't sit well on my shoulders when I'm concerned about the health and well-being of the people who work with us, and perhaps for you as well. There are still so many differences in the vaccination requirements. It's going to be difficult to get your head around what the different jurisdictions are and expect. Again, they change so quickly. Hotspots appear. The other thing is Zoom works fine. So unless you really need to be on site, maybe think about it. It's really interesting. I mentioned I was in Sydney and I had a training session in Sydney, and this was the first time in 2 years that I'd been face-to-face with a client, and I hadn't realised I was sitting on the bus heading up north and getting more and more nervous and anxious, thinking, why am I so anxious? I shouldn't be. And I realised why. This is the first time I've seen people face-to-face in their office. It's a thing. So be aware of that one. Okay.
Would you have any particular advice if, say, working via Zoom or not travelling isn't an option, you really have to go in person? What kind of risk mitigation strategies or considerations would you suggest?
Yeah, we've thought long and hard about this in our own business, and we do two things. One is we do speak with the person who's about to travel and get from them a status of their health and their concerns and their vulnerabilities. And the second is we always speak with the client where they're about to present themselves and find out from them what their protocols are, what their requirements are for people attending, and just make sure that there's no issues or problems there. So we would do that.
Fantastic. That answer already starts to bleed onto our next question, which is very similar, which is about visiting clients and how we can do this safely. So you've already slightly answered that question. Are there any other comments or points that you'd like to add?
There's a few tricks with this question. In Victoria, again, we have with our vaccination mandate, One of the requirements is for operators of facilities. And this is an unusual way to approach this, although I guess it does make sense. There are 4 different facilities that have been recognised in Victoria: aged care, education, construction, and perhaps health, where it's the operators of those facilities that are being held responsible to ensure that the people entering their workplace are properly vaccinated. Now, they can share the results of their check of the individuals with the employers and let them know if that person hasn't met the requirements. So that's a little bit of an unusual thing that you'd want to think about when you're visiting clients. Yeah.
We did get one very interesting question. It actually came up from an audit that one of our auditors was doing in the last couple of weeks, and it was about insurance and whether the pandemic and vaccinations, etc., will affect your insurances.
Probably. Well, we don't know yet. Look, it's unlikely to be something as yet that you can initiate your own insurance with, but there is no doubt it's going to impact your workers' compensation. And from 2 angles. One is the physical injury that could result from contracting the virus. The second is the mental health issues that might come with this. And we are seeing many claims, well in excess of 3,000 to date, most of those across Victoria and New South Wales. The results of those claims are yet to be processed, so we don't know the impact of them, but there is every chance that one of the impacts will be an increase in premiums, and that will be a cost that you will need to bear. There is one quite widely publicised case of a dental business owner who travelled to America in July last year, and he contracted the virus. And within a few months, by November, he'd unfortunately died in America, and his estate made a claim to iCare, which is the New South Wales workers' compensation. And they looked at the situation and determined that, yes, he was an employee and he was working at the time, and therefore there was payment made that was due. The initial sum was $11 million.
Wow.
And that would play havoc with your premiums. Now, it was appealed, and the final result appears to be a lot less, perhaps even as little as $1 million or even lower than that. So I'm not sure of the full amount that was payable, but yeah, there is definitely, I think, going to be some developments in this space of insurance, and really watch this space to see how things emerge.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. The next thing we wanted to talk through, and Dianne will talk through this briefly, is our iSuite COVID-19 approach. I'll just share that screen with you now.
Thanks, Alexia. As you probably mostly know, we do have a set of products which we call the iSuite. They're risk assessments. The best known of this is the iSafe, where we assist businesses either in their own business or the workplace of the sites where their workers are being placed to assess the safety, and we provide a report back to the employer. Now, we've developed a very similar risk assessment approach now, but this time looking at the pandemic. 8 steps. These are the things that you might want to consider in your own business. The first step is to have a look at the jurisdiction requirements in your own place, like where your own office is, but also where you are placing your workers. So find out what's the latest legal requirement being imposed. The second, and this is probably one of the most important, is to assess your workplace and worker risk. How much of the work you do, or the sites you attend, or the workers you have are at risk, and what's that level of risk? We know that the workplace is identified 4 tiers, the highest tier being where there's close contact for aged care and health and so on. So it's only one way to look at the risks in your workplace, but it can be helpful. Look also at the close contact activities that may or may not occur in your business, transport to and from work, your ability to distance in the office, the number of local cases. So a number of different factors that you can consider to assess the level of risk. Then implement base level controls. You probably already have these in place. They would be things like have a pandemic policy and a plan, have a privacy policy and a collection notice, probably suggested, but you may not have that as immediately. Might be something that you need to consider. Look at whatever state forms and checklists have been set out by the jurisdiction. I know in Victoria we don't need them now, but we did have ones which authorised workers to leave and to get onto the road and to go to different sites. There is certainly signage required for Queensland, New South and for Victoria as well. So think about that. And your distancing and hygiene and so on. And communicate all of this. Now, there are more than just your workers we're talking about here. There's your customers and perhaps other businesses that you might be visiting or maybe visiting you as well. So communicate what your protocols are, of course, but also what your expectations are when they might feel unwell or if they test positive. So what are your instructions and advice for them in those situations? Not only what are the risks at work too, but what are the risks outside work? And this is a difficult one. You can't impose it, but we do know that if people are engaging with large groups of people, nightclub, large family gatherings, festivals, outdoor activities, if you're already in a high risk category and your workers are engaging in these, then that elevates the risk for your workers in your workplace. So keep that in mind. Vaccination status, of course, and signage. Next, consult. Now, this is the bit where you're not telling them now, you're engaging with them at two different levels. One is generally, what are their general concerns? What are their responsibilities for themselves and their co-workers? What are the protocols you've put in place, vaccination requirements, etc. But also ask them as individuals, what are their vulnerabilities? What are their work preferences? And that'll give you a lot of information to work with. You may not be able to meet their work preferences every time, but do what you can. You may, and that means revise the working arrangements where it's possible, work from home, etc. Manage your workers on an ongoing basis. That would include your host clients, the facility operators, a term for here in Victoria, client visits, be aware of the cross-border travel and the site safety assessments. And the final thing really, just to be sure, is to consider any additional policies and controls that might work, that might be useful. The great value of having additional policies and controls is that when a situation arises, it ceases to be an individual response, it becomes a business-wide decision. Now, often you're not going to know which policies and procedures you'll need until an individual raises a concern or there is a particular situation. But then think about putting it into a policy and procedure. And some of the ones you might think of using are casual workers. We know from experience that many casual workers have found it very difficult to stay away from the office if they're not feeling well because they don't get paid. Some businesses have therefore been offering full payment if a worker has contracted the illness. You could consider a policy on that. Workplace health and safety. We probably all have the one generic policy, but there is scope to adapt that for these sorts of situations. Your pandemic policy might be a component of that. Working from home or other arrangements, you can pull those together in policies and controls, which you can refer to when you're looking to make arrangements for people. So I hope that's been a helpful summary of the things that you can consider.
Fantastic. Moving on a tiny bit, that forms the end of our pre-prepared questions that we received from people as they registered for the event in advance. We did really want to highlight that the purpose of today's presentation was in responding to our clients and concerns that we were hearing about COVID management, COVID vaccinations, and to share as much information with you as possible to clarify these sorts of areas. We do have additional support services in case you do have further questions or concerns, one of which is the iSafe safety assessment. So that's part of the iSafe program, a huge program that we run in the labour hire industry to assess host client sites. But we also do one-off iSafe assessments for businesses individually to consider their potential risks and controls within their own organisation. So that's not just for the labour hire industry, it is also for every single business. Safety is a concern and is a key compliance area, and so that service does help in that regard. We also have a brand new pandemic management assessment, which I'll let Dianne talk about a little bit.
Yeah, it picks up on most of the questions that we've just gone through. So it's a risk assessment. The benefit is that it's an objective assessment, gives you some ideas from a third party to help you put in place, to first identify the risks that may exist, giving you the opportunity to put in place the controls that you might need.
Yeah. We also have individual working from home management supports and assessments and just general workshops that we can provide. So this is just optional if you would like some additional support in those areas. If you do have any questions or comments, do let us know. We would love to get in touch. We would love you to get in touch. We would love to answer any of the questions that came up during this session. And we are hoping to do more of these types of presentations in future. So before we finish, we have one last poll that I would love to run with you, which just asks, in future, when we do some more webinar sessions, what kind of topics would you be interested in attending or finding out some more information on? We would really love this feedback. People are responding to that. Thank you so much for attending today's session. I really honestly hope you found it very useful. I think, Dianne, you found it really fascinating to delve into the intricacies of all of the different regulations. And we hope that this has been a fantastic, helpful resource for all of you. Any last words?
Let's just see if we've got any. We've got another few minutes, I think. See if we've got any questions that have come in that we might be able to answer.
Sure. I've just put the results of the poll up in case anyone is interested, and we'll just have a look through to see if there are any last minute questions.
Yes, there's a comment there from Tanya Evans. Thank you, Tanya. Well, one of the things that we had in mind is to make this, if you like, the first of a series of webinars on the pandemic topic. And yes, I can see many of you would be interested. And what we'd like to do for the future workshops is invite specialists. So Tanya, you would be one of them to talk about how WorkPro can support the information that needs to be collected when you're asking for the vaccination. In fact, that's one part that I didn't really discuss. What is the information? Let's talk about that at the next workshop. So thank you, Tanya.
Fantastic. There is one question that's come in which says, I'm interested in what your thoughts are for the rapid antigen tests for the office.
Yeah, okay, Kim, that's a good question. And I hadn't really thought about it, but top ahead, it is a health assessment. It would need to meet a few requirements, I guess. One is that your circumstances in the office would require it. So consider the industry, the level of risk, the close contact, the vulnerability of the people who are already there. So you've got to have a need. It's got to be a reasonable action to undertake. And then secondly, there'd have to be good information to your workers as to why and what you're doing. And that means sharing with them. I think consider the collection notice as a bit of a guide, although if they're already your employees, technically, I guess you don't need that, but you'd still want to share that kind of information with them as to the results of those tests. One other way you could manage it is to include it in your employment contract with your workers, which can be done even with the vaccination requirement too. If you've got new employment contracts coming up, you can incorporate it in that, and that gives you a good reason, a sound reason for, no, not reason's the wrong word, a sound basis upon which you may be collecting this information. So they really could be very useful, providing those criteria are met.
Beautiful. Well, if there are any extra questions that you guys are thinking on, please do get in touch with us with the contact details that are in the slides, but also you all know us, so you know how to get in touch.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to you each with any extra questions you have. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Dianne.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you all.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.